This video was brought to you by my loyal patrons. Pledge today and receive exclusive perks. Link in the description. To the average viewer, Thomas the Tank Engine is just a kid's property. A series of books, and later a TV series about colorful trains with talking faces. And while that's not untrue, Thomas is a kid's property about talking colorful trains with faces, there's quite a bit more going on beneath the surface. At the core of this nearly 80-year franchise was creator Reverend Wilbert Awdry, a passionate railway enthusiast who based all of Thomas and his friends on real-life locomotives from around the world, all with interesting stories to tell. And he used these engines' unique histories and quirks and mishaps to shape the personalities of the characters in his railway series. There is such a high level of research and authenticity to Awdry's vision of the island of Sodor. Every engine has ties with real-world ones in history. And today, we're going to talk about all of them. This is a video that's been requested by many over the past year or so. I do go into the inspirations and prototypes of the characters in their respective Sodor's Finest videos, but what about all the others that I haven't covered? What about some of those obscure ones that will probably never get their own video? What is D40125's story, goddammit? So, everyone will be getting some time in the spotlight today, and everyone's story will be covered. My goal here is for you to walk away from this video having learned something new about these characters and the real locos that they are based on. Now, quick disclaimer, this video will only be covering engines within the Railway series lore, so we will not be touching on TV characters. You will not be seeing Salty or Emily here. Now, I did originally consider covering everyone from books and TV, but I quickly realized that that was just going to be too much for one video. I'm only one guy. Perhaps we'll cover the TV guys in a part 2 at a later date. And secondly, we will only be covering the characters with definitive prototypes. There will be a lot of oddballs covered here, don't worry, but ones like the background engines in the first book, for example, or this thing, we're just going to skip, simply because we don't know what their prototypes are, if any. There's simply just no information on them. I'm also going to skip some minor engines mentioned in lore books or lectures, like the varying copy pots or blisters 1 and 2, for example, simply for a lack of visuals to use for them. I'll make a few exceptions for characters we do have enough info on to warrant their own sections, and I will point those out as we get to them. We are just going to stick to the facts here. Engines with real-world histories and stories to be told. We will go in order of build year, starting with the oldest engine and working our way up to the most recent. We shall begin our journey through railway history towards the beginning of the 19th century. The oldest known engine to appear in the Railway series is, well, one of the first ever. Stephenson's Rocket, or simply just Rocket for short, is a 022 tender engine built in 1829 by Robert Stephenson and Company in Newcastle for the Rainhill Trials. In 1829, the nearly completed Liverpool and Manchester Railway were seeking a source of motive power. They were considering a cable-hauled system, as steam locomotives were still unproven at the time. George Stephenson of Robert Stephenson and Company made the argument that steam locomotives were the future and would be the best motive power for this new railway. Consequently, the directors staged a competition between various steam engine designers to test this risky claim, which would come to be known as the Rainhill Trials. Of the 5 engines that competed, Stephenson's locomotive, Rocket, was the only of them to actually finish, and subsequently Robertson Stephenson and Company were given the contract to produce a fleet of locomotives for the railway. Rocket was by no means the first ever steam locomotive built, but it was the first of its kind, pioneering several innovations to create the most advanced locomotive of its time. Its success at the trials secured its place in railway history, as it became the template for all subsequent steam locomotives following it. The pace of engineering innovation was so fast at the time that even by when the Liverpool and Manchester Railway was opened, Rocket was already considered out of date, and so was rebuilt with more conventional features such as a smoke box and horizontal pistons. Rocket was miraculously preserved, and can still be seen today at the Locomotion branch of the National Railway Museum in Shildon. Rocket appears in Book 35, Thomas and the Great Railway Show, as one of the many famous National Railway Museum engines that Thomas met there. However, the Rocket that Thomas meets is not the original. Thomas met the working replica, built in 1979 to the original design as used in the trials. Strangely, the replica here is not depicted with a face, likely because there was no convenient place for the illustrator to put one, and has no dialogue. So, it's kind of up to interpretation if the engine is in fact alive in this universe. Now, the TV series presented Rocket in a very different way. Stevenson's Rocket, he goes by Stephen for short, was brought to Sodor to be fully restored to a working state. Here, he is depicted as a combination of Rocket's two conditions, the angled pistons from the original build, and the added smoke box and buffer beam from the rebuild. In the show's universe, Stephen is in fact the real Rocket, and now resides at the Ulfstead Castle Estate under Sir Robert Norramby's custodianship, instead of the National Railway Museum as per real life. It's TV series logic, just roll with it. Fast forward about 20 years to 1847, and we have Iron Duke, another ancient engine that Thomas met at the National Railway Museum. Built in Swindon, Iron Duke was the first of the batch of the, aptly named, Iron Duke class of the Great Western Railway. These 422 tender locomotives were broad gauge, spanning a track width of about 7 feet. They were built for express passenger work, with a top recorded speed of about 78 miles per hour. None of the original Iron Dukes were preserved, and Iron Duke itself was withdrawn in 1871, after about 24 years of service. So, how was Thomas able to meet him in 1990? Well, the Iron Duke that Thomas met was, again, a working replica. Built in 1985 in celebration of the Great Western Railway's 150th anniversary, this replica worked a broad gauge demonstration line at the National Railway Museum. That's right, this Iron Duke was only a wee 5 years old when Thomas met him, making his whiskery eyebrows and big grey mustache quite contrary. Personally, I like to think that they were fake and put on him by the museum to give the illusion to visitors that he was very old. The replica Iron Duke was built using the boiler of a Hunslet Austerity tank engine, the same that Wilbert N16 are, with some significant modifications, making it quite a bizarre hybrid of an engine. The replica now permanently resides at the Didcot Railway Centre, and can be seen today on the broad gauge demonstration line there. Bumping up a couple years to 1851, and we have a rather elusive character, Bloomer. Bloomer is a character that never appeared in the books, but does exist in canon through a model that Wilbert Awdry built himself, and later developed a history for in his Railways of Sodor lecture. He is admittedly a pretty bizarre character to include in this video since he never really existed, but there is enough of a history here to warrant a mention. The Bloomers were a class of 222 tender locomotives built by various builders across the UK for express passenger services on the London and North Western Railway. All of this class were withdrawn by 1888, making it quite a miracle that one survived long enough to make it to Sodor in the present day. The story goes that the engine was discovered rusting away in a long-abandoned shed in Wigtonshire, Scotland by Sir Charles Hatt in the early 1970s. Upon its discovery, the engine was brought to Sodor and restored to working order. The engine, creatively named Bloomer, was restored in time to make an appearance at the Stockton and Darlington's 150th celebration in Shildon in 1975. Since then, Bloomer is rarely seen in public, and was occasionally used for special trains on the Farquhar branch. Bloomer is specifically one of the 25 examples built in 1851 by Sharp Stewart and Company in Glasgow, Scotland. Beyond that, not much more is known about him, or if he's still kept in working condition, but he would be the oldest living engine on the island of Sodor. In real life, the Bloomer class exists today in the form of a non-working replica called Wilberton, built in 1991. This can be seen today at the Milton Keynes Museum in England. Believe it or not, there's a second Bloomer replica being produced at Tyseley Works. Locomotive number 670 was started all the way back in 1986, being nearly complete in 1990 when the project stalled indefinitely. It was officially resumed in 2019 and is still in progress. Eventually, we will see a Bloomer steam again. Let's jump ahead 10 or so years to 1861, and we have our first familiar Sodor face, Neil. Neil is, as Audrey describes him, an off-the-peg 040 box tank, one of several built by Nielsen & Company at their Hyde Park Works in Glasgow, Scotland. Hundreds of these box tanks were built for use all over the world, with varying design elements. Despite the widespread use of these locomotives, none have survived into preservation. Neil himself is the second of 3 engines that were built circa 1861 to help construct and later run the Sodor and Mainland Railway. Neil and his 2 brothers were the first railway steam engines on the island of Sodor. The railway fell into hard times, and the engines were eventually sold off or scrapped. Neil went on to work for the Crovansgate Mining Company, and last we heard he existed at least till the formation of the Northwestern Railway in 1914. But thanks to poor record keeping, his fate after that is unknown. It's possible he is still around somewhere today, locked up in a shed or rotting away on an abandoned siding. We'll simply never know. Neil's name is a reference to his builder, Nielsen & Company, and his thick Scottish accent reflects where he was built.
"So you're bound for the wee railway," he said. "Ye must put some order into those trucks. Brave as they make you'd hardly believe."
1864 saw the construction of an engine that we all know and love, Skarloey. Skarloey is a narrow-gauge engine, the first built for the Skarloey Railway, hence his name. He is based on the unique Talyllyn of the Talyllyn Railway in Wales. Talyllyn was built in 1864 by Fletcher Jennings & Company in Whitehaven, England. Originally one of their standard Class A 040 saddle tanks with an open cab, the engine would receive numerous modifications over the years, gaining a rear pony truck to keep her from bouncing, and a proper cab with a unique wraparound shape. For 80 or so years, the Talyllyn operated with only 2 engines, until it faced hard times in the 1940s. However, thanks to the efforts of some enthusiastic volunteers in 1951, the Talyllyn became the world's first preserved railway, and its 2 engines, Talyllyn and Dalgach, were saved. Talyllyn is still around and well, and can be found working on the Little Welsh Line to this day. In the books, Skarloey and Talyllyn are long-separated twins, built together in 1864 to the same design in Whitehaven. While Talyllyn went off to Wales, Skarloey was shipped off to Sodor. Following a few incidents, Skarloey was sent back to Whitehaven to be rebuilt, receiving the same modifications that Talyllyn did. Like his real-life twin, Skarloey is still around today, and is the oldest known working engine on the island of Sodor. Jumping 1 year ahead, we have Skarloey's brother, Rheneas. Rheneas is based on Dalgach, the other of the 2 unique engines built for the Talyllyn Railway in Wales. Like Talyllyn, Dalgach was designed and built by Fletcher Jennings in Whitehaven in 1866 as one of their BB Class 040 well tanks. Dalgach was delivered to the Talyllyn later that year, and her long wheelbase successfully prevented her from bouncing like Talyllyn did. Between 1900 and 1914, Dalgach was temporarily renamed Pretoria, in celebration of British troops entering Pretoria in South Africa during the Boer War. During the Talyllyn's twilight years in the 40s, Dalgach, in increasingly decrepit condition, single-handedly kept the railway running while Talyllyn was out of action. After the railway was preserved in 1951, more locomotives were brought on to run the line, and Dalgach received a much-deserved overhaul. Like her sister, Dalgach is still around and can be seen working today on the Talyllyn. Unlike Skarloey, Rheneas was not built alongside his real-life twin. Rheneas was built first, in 1865, and was already shipped off to Sodor before Dalgach was complete in 1866. Rheneas is also still around, working alongside his big bro. Moving into the 1870s now, we have Albert. Albert is an engine that used to work on the Furness Railway, and was the original engine Victoria the coach worked with before making her way to Sodor. Albert was originally built in 1872 at Sharp Stewart & Company in Glasgow as one of their off-the-peg E1 class tender engines. 7 of these were later rebuilt into tank engines that were better suited for branch line work. A bunker was added, and a rear pony truck, turning them into 242 tank engines. These 7 rebuilds were reclassified as the J1 class, and worked the Lakeside branch to Windermere, as accurately depicted in the book Thomas and Victoria. Albert's number was never revealed, so we don't know which of the class that he was. But nonetheless, all 7 J1s were scrapped by 1924 in real life. Rest in peace, Al. Hopping up to 1875, specifically December 21st, 1875, was the birth of everyone's favorite terrier, Stepney. Stepney is one of the few engines in the series that is actually a real engine. Built in Brighton Works in 1875, Stepney was part of the London, Brighton and South Coast Railway's A1 class, a small 060 tank engine designed to haul commuter trains in the Greater London area. These engines were nicknamed Terriers for their distinctive chuffing. The chuffs sound like a dog barking. Stepney was sent back to Brighton to be rebuilt in 1912, in which he gained a new boiler design, a larger smoke box, and other modifications. These rebuilt Terriers were reclassified as A1Xs. The Terriers were a long-lasting class. Several lasted well into the British Railways era, some nearing 80 years old at that point. Stepney was one of several that was relocated to the Hayling Island branch, a lightly laid line in the south of England that could only handle the weight of these little locos, and he spent his final working years there until withdrawal in 1960. While simply just one of many Terriers until this point, Stepney really came to fame when he was saved from the Cutter's Torch and was selected to be the first engine to work on a new heritage line in Sussex, the Bluebell Railway. As the railway's first engine, he became its poster boy, and still is to this day. Stepney is still around and can be viewed in the Steamworks exhibit at Sheffield Park Station. In the Railway series, Stepney did a publicity run for the Bluebell across England to the island of Sodor in 1962, and he worked there on loan for a little while. He hasn't been back since, as far as we know, likely because all the kids visiting the Bluebell would keep asking where he is. Topping the 1870s is old Grandpuff himself, Duke. Duke was the first engine of the now long-defunct Mid-Sodor Railway. He is based on the Small England class of the Festiniog Railway in Wales, an interesting design, a saddle tank engine with a tender. The Small Englands were originally a fleet of 4 side tank locomotives, very squarish in design, first built in 1863 at George England and Company's works in New Cross, South London. These included Princess, Prince, Mountaineer, and Palmerston. In 1867, 2 more engines were built that improved on the design, Welsh Pony and Little Giant. These 2 had saddle tanks, larger boilers, a longer wheelbase, and were classified as large Englands. Over time, all the Small Englands were all rebuilt to accommodate the distinctive saddle tanks. Most of the Englands are still around today, and can be seen working on the Festiniog Railway in Wales. Duke is the oddball. He is a small England, and unlike the others, was built at the Festiniog's Boston Lodge Works in Minford, to the order of John Arnold Norramby, Earl of Sodor, for the Mid-Sodor Railway. He arrived on Sodor in 1879, and was the first known tender engine on the island. Duke hauled the Mid-Sodor's opening day train in 1880, and worked the line alongside many other engines until its closure in 1947. Once thought to be lost to time, Duke was found buried in a shed at Arlesdale over 20 years later in 1969, and is now happily preserved on the Skarloey Railway. Up next is a rather elusive character, number 1020. 1020 is the number of an unnamed engine that Toby once met while traveling to the seaside during his LNER days on the mainland. The engine was described as clanking, with steam leaking in all directions, clearly not taken care of well. Toby helped him out, and assisted in pulling his train to the seaside. 1020 is a Great Eastern Y14 Class 060 tender engine, later reclassified as a J15 when the Great Eastern was absorbed into the greater LNER. These engines were built over the course of 30 years, with the first examples built in 1883, and the final ones in 1913. The majority were built at Stratford Works in East London, with 19 of them built by Shart Stewart and Company in Glasgow in 1884. They were initially designed in response to the Great Eastern's sudden need for freight locos to run a new joint line to Doncaster. However, they proved they were capable of more than that, also being able to tackle passenger work easily. As a maid-of-all-work, the Great Eastern just kept building more and more of them over the years. 259 existed in total, and all were withdrawn by 1962. One example is preserved, number 564. It resides on the North Norfolk Railway, wearing its original Great Eastern blue livery. One J15 of particular interest is number 930, built in 1891. The Great Eastern held a world record for this engine, the fastest construction of a steam engine ever built, in just 9 hours and 45 minutes. The record is still unbeaten to this day. Now, 1020 is a bit of a contradictory engine. His number, 1020, is not a number ever worn by a J15, making him a fictional member of the class. It was, however, worn by the LNER B1 class, Gemsbach. To add to that, the text refers to him as younger than Toby.
The engine was younger than Toby, but he was dirty, his rods clanked, and steam leaked from everywhere.
Which is such a strange little detail to even bring up. The character is rusty and falling apart. Every aspect about his appearance suggests that he's old. Yet, they specifically mention that he's younger. Which doesn't even make sense, because the very final J15s were built in 1913, exactly 1 year before Toby was built, who we'll get to soon. There's no way that this engine could really be younger than Toby, but as he's a fictional member, maybe in this universe, the Great Eastern ordered another batch of these engines sometime after 1914. Who's to say? And now for one of the more interesting engines of the video, Bert, the little miniature engine of the Arlesdale Railway. Bert is based on River Ert, one of the original engines of the 15-inch gauge Ravenglass and Eskdale Railway in the Lake District of England. River Ert started life as a very, very different engine. First built by Sir Arthur Heywood in Duffield in 1894, her name was originally Muriel, and was a boxy minimum gauge 080 tank engine. She moved around to different railways of England in her early years, and finally arrived on the Ravenglass in 1917, and here she stayed. As the Ravenglass expanded, Muriel was rebuilt into a larger engine to better suit the railway's needs. In 1927, she gained a rear pony truck, becoming an 082, and was converted into a tender engine with cut-down fittings. Upon this rebuild, the engine was renamed River Ert, and it was this condition that Bert was based on. River Ert's strange rebuild history doesn't end there, though. In 1972, she was rebuilt again at the Yorkshire Engine Company in Sheffield, being given a narrow gauge outline with a taller chimney and cab. She remains in this condition today. Bert's history mirrors River Ertz. Originally built in circa 1894 as a 080 tank engine, he was later converted into a tender engine in an attempt to cure his shy steaming problems, but to no avail. He, along with Rex and later Mike, worked their line in England till its closure in 1967, and from there went to work on the new Arlesdale Railway on Sodor. In 1973, following River Ertz rebuild, Bert was also given the same enhancements, and only then were his steaming issues finally cured. Bert has never been depicted in the series with his taller chimney and cab though, and was incorrectly depicted in his second form in the last two stories of the book Jock the New Engine, which take place in 1976. Funnily enough, Bert calls Mike and Rex older in the story sticking power.
"Sorry you're tired," he said brightly. "I thought you older engines had sticking power."
I am not totally sure what he meant by that, as Bert is a good 30-ish years older than Rex, and a whopping 72 years older than Mike. More on them later. And we finally arrived at the first of the main characters, the oldest and wisest of the gang, Edward. Edward's origins are a bit iffy, but it is believed that he was built in 1896 at Sharp Stewart & Company in Glasgow, Scotland, for use on the Furness Railway. These 440 tender engines were classified as the K2, or Larger Seagull class. 6 were built originally in 1896, and 2 additional ones in 1900. The K2s hauled express passenger trains along the Cumbrian coast. All were sadly scrapped by 1931, and none survived into preservation. Edward is the K2 that got away. Unimpressed with his shy steaming, the Furness saw no issue with loaning him to the neighboring island of Sodor in 1915 to help with the construction of the Northwestern Railway there. As the Furness had no real desire to get Edward back, Edward simply stayed on Sodor, and eventually became part of the Northwestern's fleet in 1921. Nowadays, Edward bears little resemblance to his original form, as he has been substantially rebuilt at Crovan's Gate over the years into what is now quite a reliable steamer. His Furness number has never been revealed, so we don't know exactly which K2 he was. We do know that he was one of the first batch of 6 in 1896, and some fans have speculated he was either number 34 or 35. Both of these were fitted with longer smokebox superheaters in 1913, giving them a smokebox profile that better resembles Edward's in the illustrations. In real life, these were both removed in 1914, not long before Edward would have disappeared to Sodor. Make of that as you will. Moving into the 20th century now, coming all the way from Switzerland is Culdee. Culdee was one of the 5 original engines of the Culdee Fell Mountain Railway built in 1900. He was the 4th of the batch, the others being Godred, Ernest, Wilfred, and Shane Dooiney. All 5 of them are based on the original 5 engines of the real-life Snowdon Mountain Railway in Wales. These 042 locomotives are unique in design, built with a single purpose: to climb steep grades. The engines all have angled boilers and a set of pinion wheels in the center of their axles to hold on to a rack in the middle of the track, which prevents them from slipping backwards as they ascend. They have no couplings, and always push their trains up the mountain. Gravity does the rest when they descend. They simply just roll back down. The original 5 engines, Lattice, Enid, Widfa, Snowdon, and Mole Shapad, respectively, were designed and built at the Swiss Locomotive and Machine Works in Winterthur, Switzerland in 1895, and shipped to Wales upon completion. The Snowdon Railway opened for traffic on April 6, 1896, and suffered its only major derailment on its opening day. The first engine, Lattice, came off the rails while descending and tumbled over the mountain edge, smashing itself to pieces. Only one person died from the incident, a passenger who jumped out of the coach during the derailment. The railway has had a perfect safety record since this incident, and poor Lattice was never replaced. The railway's history is reflected in the fictional Culdee Fells. The railway was based on the successful Snowdon, though is quite a bit longer. It opened for traffic a few years later in 1900. Its first engine, Godred, suffered the same fate as Lattice during one of his descents, coming off the rails at a bend and tumbling over the mountainside. He was deemed irreparable and was placed at the back of the shed as spare parts for the others. Aside from Lattice, the remaining 4 of the original batch of locomotives still exist today on the Snowdon Mountain Railway and are used for their occasional steam services. The turn of the century also presented to the world the little green goblin himself, Percy. Now, full disclaimer, Percy is an absolute enigma, and no one is quite sure what he started life as, so no one really knows what year he was built. As Audrey notes, Percy is an 040 saddle tank, likely built originally by the Avonside Engine Company in Bristol, sometime after the turn of the century. Specifically, a design with his smokebox exposed and saddle tank fixed behind it. He was rebuilt substantially by previous owners over the years, who added on parts from Hunslet, among other manufacturers. It's believed that his rear bunker was also a later addition, as pretty much all Avonside-built 040s never received them. A saddle tank of a similar design that we can compare him to is Trojan. Built by Avonside in 1897 for Messer Dunn and Shute of Newport Town Dock, Trojan bears a close resemblance to Percy, but even then there are some pretty big differences. Trojan is preserved and currently resides at Didcot Railway Centre. The truth of the matter is that Percy sadly has no exact real-life basis. Avonside built saddle tanks of Percy's likeness well into the early 1920s, so really it's anyone's guess when he was built. All we can assume is that it had to be sometime near the turn of the century, as he had to have a couple previous owners that rebuilt him before going to Sodor in 1926 or so. Jeez, with all this uncertainty, it's quite perplexing that no one thought to simply just ask him when and where he was built.
Percy, mind if I ask you a question?
Oh, yes, sir.
Where and when were you built?
Oh, Avonside, 1902, sir.
Oh, thanks. Well, that was easy. Why has no one thought to just ask you before?
1903 gave us another real engine, the famous celebrity City of Truro. City of Truro was built in Swindon as one of the Great Western Railway's 3700 City class. All of these express passenger 440s were named after famous cities in England, such as City of Bath, City of London, etc. Hence their nickname, the City class. 10 of these locomotives were built, and an additional 10 later on in 1907, which were rebuilt from the existing Atborough class. City of Truro came to fame on May 9, 1904, when it reached 100 miles per hour, becoming the first steam locomotive in Britain to achieve it. The speed record is, however, still debated to this day, as the speed was determined by stopwatch timings and not by dynamometer. Not to mention arguments from across the pond that claimed the New York Central and Hudson River Railroad 440, number 999, had already achieved the record in 1893, however with little supporting evidence. Flying Scotsman would go on to be the first steam locomotive in Britain to officially surpass 100 miles per hour in 1934, with recorded evidence. Nonetheless, City of Truro gained immense fame from this achievement, and went on to be the poster boy for the Great Western. Truro was preserved in 1931 at the Elleniars Museum in York, and can be found today at the Museum of the Great Western Railway in Swindon. In the railway series, Truro made his way to Sodor on a publicity tour in 1957, coinciding with the real engine's restoration by British Railways. On this trip, he met Duck, and the two spent the night discussing all things Great Western. His visit gave Duck quite an inflated ego afterwards. 1 year later saw the introduction of Sir Handel in 1904. Sir Handel started life named as Falcon, and was built for use on the Mid-Sodor Railway. He and his history are based on the Tallaghclin Railway's number 3, Sir Hayden. Sir Hayden was originally a 040 saddle tank locomotive, originally built by Hughes Locomotive Works, later Falcon Works, in Loughborough, for the Corus Railway in Wales, all the way back in 1878. 3 of these engines were sent over, and worked the line for nearly half a century. In 1921, a fourth engine from Kerr Stuart and Company was brought on, and the best parts of the 3 Falcon locomotives were combined into a single engine. This locomotive continued to carry the number 3 following. When the chorus closed, number 3, along with the Kerr Stuart, were sold to the newly preserved Tallyclin Railway in 1951. Upon arrival, it was officially named Sir Haydon, after the railway's owner, Sir Haydon Jones. Sir Haydon had a tendency to fall between the Tallyclin's poorly kept rails during its early preservation years, and has been substantially rebuilt and modified since to suit the railway's needs. He can still be seen working on the Tallyclin to this day. Sir Handel is much younger than Sir Haydon, being built nearly 30 years later in 1904. He was also built at Falcon Works in Loughborough, and was shipped to the Mid-Sodor to replace a previously scrapped engine. Upon arrival, he was named Falcon after his builder. Falcon spent his life on the Mid-Sodor with Duke and Stuart until the line's closure in 1947. After that, he and Stuart went to work at the island's aluminum works for a spell, until finally being brought to the Skarloey Railway in 1952. Upon arrival, he was renamed Sir Handel, after the railway's owner, Sir Handel Brown. Like the real Sir Haydon, Sir Handel had a tendency to fall between the rails of the Skarloey's worn tracks, and was given special wheels with wide tires to prevent this. The engines often teased him, and called them steamroller wheels. Coming in 1909 are the Scottish twins, Donald and Douglas. Donald and Douglas come from the Caledonian Railway in Scotland. They arrived on Sodor wearing the BR numbers 57646 and 57647 respectively. This numbering would have placed them at the tail end of the 652 class, a subclass of the more well-known 812 class, with minor mechanical differences and cabin frame shapes. These were powerful 060 tender engines, built mostly for heavy goods traffic. The first of the 812 class were built in 1899, with the 17652 variants being built from 1908 to 1909. All of the 652s were built at St. Rollocks Works in Glasgow. All these numbers getting confusing yet? Now, the Island of Sodor book states that Donald and Douglas are 812s, built in 1899, despite their numbers placing them in the 652 class of 1908. The final 652 was built in 1909, bearing the number 661, and then 17645 under LMS ownership, and finally 57645 under BR. Donald and Douglas's BR numbers, 57646 and 57647, are fictional add-ons, meaning we can assume that they were likely built around the same time as the real 57645 in 1909. However, this isn't completely certain, and it's unknown what their original Caledonian numbers would have been. A single example of the original 812 class, Caledonian number 828, is preserved, and currently resides on the Strathspey Railway in Aviemore, Scotland. Next up is James, built circa 1912. James is based on the 28 class of the Lancashire and Yorkshire Railway, a 060 mixed traffic tender engine, built to handle goods trains and passenger trains at speed. 63 of these were rebuilds of the railway's previous 27 class, of which over 400 existed. These rebuilds included extending the footplate, larger sandboxes, and swapping the fireboxes with square bell pair ones. 42 additional all-new 28s joined the class, bringing the total number up to 105. All of the 28s were built at the LNYR's works in Horwich. One of the Class 28's pitfalls were their fronts being rather nose-heavy, and this gave them a tendency to bounce when traveling at speed. As per Audrey's notes, in 1912, designer George Hughes experimented by retrofitting his 28 design to feature a front pony truck in an attempt to counteract this. The engine was built and proved to not really fix the problem. This experimental locomotive was James. After the railway's absorption into the LMS in 1923, the LMS saw no use for him and sold him off to the Northwestern Railway, where he still resides to this day. He has remained in his unique red livery since then, and has had most of his issues fixed at Crovan's Gate Works. None of the 28s survived into preservation in real life, but a single 27 does. LNYR number 1300, built in 1895. It resides at the East Lancashire Railway, currently sporting its BR number 52322. 2 years later, in 1914, was the start of World War I. It was also the year that Toby was built. Coincidence?
I'll let you decide.
Toby is based on the unmistakable J70 class tram engine of the Wisbech and Upwell Tramway. Originally classified as the Class C53 under the Great Eastern Railway, this batch of 12 060 tram locomotives were built at Stratford Works in East London. The Wisbech and Upwell Tramway ran alongside roads and through towns for a large portion of its distance, and the line's locomotives were fitted with side plates covering their wheels to prevent people from being dragged under should a collision occur. With a cab at each end, the C53s were extremely versatile engines, also finding use on other parts of the Great Eastern's network that necessitated running over public roads. When grouping occurred and the Great Eastern Railway was absorbed into the LNER in 1923, the C53s were reclassified as J70s. They lasted for a bit after the formation of British Railways, with the final being withdrawn in 1955. They were subsequently replaced by BR's Class 04 diesel shunters, the same class of diesel as Mavis. Little known fact, Toby is in fact a real engine. As noted in both the Island of Sodor book and Sodor Reading Between the Lines, it's heavily believed that Toby's BR number was 68221, meaning his original Great Eastern number would have been 127. The real 68221 was scrapped in 1951, which just so happened to be the same year that Toby left Ipswich for Sodor. What a coincidence, huh? In real life, sadly, none of the J70s survived into preservation. The last survivor was set aside at Stratford Works to be preserved, but was cut up in error. 1 year later, the world was presented with a tank engine that would change everything. A tank engine named Thomas. Thomas is an E2 class tank engine, a bulky 060 built for the London, Brighton and South Coast Railway. 5 of these powerful engines were first built between 1913 and 1914 at Brighton Works, with the intention to use them for shunting and short-distance freight trains in the London area. They were also briefly trialed on push-pull passenger services, and while effective shunters, they ultimately were unfit for pulling trains due to their small coal bunkers, which limited their fuel capacity needed for longer distances. Another one of the design's faults was its small water supply. To fix this, the next batch of 5 E2s, starting in 1915, were designed with longer tanks that extended forward to the smokebox. Thomas is specifically one of this batch. The E2s eventually landed at Southampton Docks, where they were trialed as shunters. They performed very well at this, and here they lived out the remainder of their lives, lasting till nearly the end of steam. The E2s often get a lot of hate and have a reputation for being sucky engines, but I don't find that to be entirely fair. They failed at the jobs that they were initially designed for, yes, but they found success at another job within the scope of their design. And clearly they were useful at Southampton, as they lasted until the end of steam there. Not exactly what I'd call a sucky engine. The final withdrawal occurred in 1963, and sadly, none of the E2s were preserved. Now, regarding Thomas. As the Island of Sodor book notes, Thomas arrived on Sodor in 1915 during the war effort. He is specifically one of the E2s with the extended side tanks, and that means he could have only been built in 1915. Only 2 E2s were built this year, number 105 in June and number 106 in September. He is likely one of these 2, or is possibly a fictional 11th member. We'll simply never know. Like Edward and Henry, Thomas has been rebuilt substantially during his life on Sodor. His biggest rebuild occurred in 1960 after he showed up to breakfast in the Farquhar station master's house. Modifications included lowering his water tank, and flattening out his running board, removing his distinctive dip at the front. He only vaguely resembles an E2 nowadays, with his extended side tanks being really the only hint of what he once was. 1917 was the year the series' first American engine was built. All the way from the Keystone State was Stanley. Stanley, or simply just Number 2 as Duke referred to him, was a 1012D class narrow gauge engine from America, built at Baldwin Locomotive Works in Eddystone, Pennsylvania. He appears in a total of only 2 illustrations in the books, but has quite a story. The 1012D was a class of 460 pannier tank engines, built specifically for use by the British War Department over lightly laid trench railways in France during World War I. Nearly 500 of these locomotives were built. After the war, they became Army surplus and were sold off to private owners. 50 went off to India, and the grand majority went to various railways in the UK. 6 are preserved in varying rebuilt forms, most of which can be found on heritage railways in the UK. On Wilbert Awdry's own mid-Sodor layout, he had a model of a Baldwin 1012D, which he nicknamed Stanley. The model kept derailing, however, so Wilbert, fed up with it, eventually cut it up and turned it into set dressing as a static pumping engine. This ordeal served as inspiration for the character's story. Stanley was built in 1917 and started his life in the trenches in France. After the war ended, he was sold to the Mid-Sodor Railway and was re-gauged. He wasn't re-gauged properly though, and as a result tended to ride roughly and derail often. He saw it as nothing to get upset about, but eventually the railwaymen got sick of him and stripped him of his wheels, putting him to use as a stationary pumping engine at the back of the shed. He was moved eventually to work as a pumping engine at the Casney-Howen mines, but the mines flooded and were closed. Stanley was more than likely abandoned there. Quite a sad fate for what is basically a veteran. While Stanley technically never appeared in the TV series at all, his story lives on in the form of Smudger, a reckless engine from Duke's Old Railway that suffered the exact same fate as him. We've finally reached Henry, the engine with probably the most complicated backstory of the whole series. Henry was, by all regards, a screw-up, and his origins are even more elusive than Percy's. While we pretty much know where Percy was at least built, Henry is a total mystery. Here's the story. In 1919, a scandal occurred at Doncaster Works, the location where Sir Nigel Gresley's famous LNER engines were later constructed. Rumors had gone around that Gresley was developing a Pacific locomotive for the Great Northern Railway, which he indeed was, and we will soon get to that. A rival locomotive builder wanted to beat him to it. There was a break-in, and the robber got away with some of Gresley's drawings, only to discover that he had blundered and stolen rejected designs with some pretty big flaws, one of which was an undersized firebox. The mistake was realized too late, when the engine was already nearly completed at its non-disclosed workshop. The end result was Henry, a Pacific that somewhat resembled what would be Gresley's A1 class. Eager to get their white elephant of an engine off their hands, the builder sold Henry off to the first customer, who just so happened to be Sir Topham Hatt I of the Northwestern Railway, who was in desperate need of an express engine. Hatt expected to receive a Robinson Atlantic, but instead got Henry. To say that he was unhappy with his new engine would be an understatement. Henry continued to be put to work on the Northwestern, though his small firebox handicapped him, and the poor guy often fell ill. One fateful morning in 1935, though, Henry had a severe accident while holding the Flying Kipper. The damage was so drastic that Henry had to be rebuilt. Hatt saw this as an opportunity and called in a favor with his old friend, William Stanier, the then real-life chief mechanical engineer at Crewe Works. When Henry returned to Sodor later that year, he looked like a completely different engine, rebuilt to the outline of a LMS Class 5 tender engine, or more commonly known, a Black 5. The success of the Black 5s in real life cannot be understated. They were designed by Stanley as the ultimate do-anything, go-anywhere type of engine, and they certainly proved they could. First introduced in 1934, interestingly enough, not long before Henry was rebuilt, over 800 Black Fives were built for use across the LMS's system, and later, nearly all across Britain. They were big, powerful, could go anywhere, and pull anything. The Black Fives existed till the very end of steam in 1968. In fact, the final ever steam-hauled mainline train on British Rail was hauled by Black Fives. This was known as the 15 Guinea Special, and occurred on August 11, 1968, the day before BR's steam ban across the entire system. A whopping 18 Black Fives are preserved today, and can be found on various heritage railways. Now, as far as we know, Henry in his original form is not based on anything in real life. Between 1915 and 1922, Gresley proposed several prototype Pacific designs that were all rejected. It's unknown which of these Henry is specifically based on, if any at all. It should also be noted that Henry is not exactly a Black Five. Quoting Sodor reading between the lines, Henry is described as looking very much like a Stanley Class 5, meaning there are likely some differences between him and the standard design. What those differences are, though, we'll probably never know. Entering the 20s now, and the world was introduced to the ever-pleasant Peter Sam. Peter Sam's story, like the other narrow gauge engines, mirrors that of the engine he is based on, the Tallyclin Railway's number 4 Edward Thomas. Edward Thomas started life as a bog-standard 042 Tattoo-class saddle tank engine from Kerr Stewart, built in 1921 at their workshops in Stoke-on-Trent, though cut down to fit the restricted loading gauge of its intended home, the Corus Railway in Wales, as their number 4. Numbers 4 and 3 worked the Corus until its closure in 1947. Following closure, the nearby Tallyclin Railway, which had recently been preserved, purchased the two engines to help run the line. Number 4 was officially named Edward Thomas after the railway's former manager. He was rebuilt slightly to fit the Tallyclin's needs, and has proven to be quite reliable. Even to this day, Edward Thomas tends to be the favorite of the railway's engine crews, as it is the easiest to work on. In 1958, Dr. Adolf Giesel Geislingen, I probably just butchered that, approached British Railways to sell him his Giesel ejector, a blast pipe arrangement with a strange triangular-shaped chimney, which he claimed lessened coal consumption. When BR rejected him, he approached the Tallyclin, and Edward Thomas was fitted with one. It was finally removed in 1969, as no difference in coal consumption was found, and it was difficult to maintain. The Giesel still exists though, and is on display at the Tallyclin's Narrow Gauge Museum. Peter Sam's story mirrors Edward Thomas's to nearly a T, though there are a few differences. For one, Peter Sam is older. He was built a year before in 1920 for the Mid-Sodor Railway. The railway named him Stewart after his builder, Kerr Stewart and Company. After the Mid-Sodor's closure, Stewart and Falcon went off to the nearby aluminum works for a couple years, and then finally to the Skarloey Railway. Here he was renamed Peter Sam after the railway's controller. Like Edward Thomas, Peter Sam was also fitted with a Giesel ejector in 1961. But unlike Edward Thomas, he still retains his. It's proven to make puffing much easier for him, and all the other engines secretly wish they had one too. 1920 also presented us with the kingpin of the North Western Railway, Gordon. Gordon was the North Western's top link express engine, and the fastest steam engine of the railway. For nearly 90 years, he hauled the railway's Wild Nor'Wester service, an almost non-stop journey from Tidmouth to Barrow-in-Furness. Gordon is based on Sir Nigel Gresley's famous A1 Pacifics of the Great Northern Railway. He, however, is not one of the original 52 built. Gordon was the unsung prototype, outshopped from Doncaster Works in either 1920 or 21. As Gresley used him to work out kinks in the final design, Gordon remained rather hush-hush from the public and was never put into regular traffic, nor ever wore a Great Northern number. He did, however, wear the Great Northern's apple green livery, as he once stated,
When I was young and green, he said, I remember going to London.
Aesthetically, he does not differ much from the final A1 designs, the most notable difference being his front flowing sloped footplate, contrast to the more abrupt drop on the final A1s. The first A1 completed was number 1470, Great Northern, outshopped in 1922. Others followed, and once the first batch was completed, Gordon was no longer needed. He was sold off to the highest bidder, who just so happened to be Sir Topham Hatt I of the North Western Railway, who was ecstatic to have a Gresley Express engine running on his rails. Gordon was sent to Sodor in 1923, complete with a spare boiler and firebox. Gresley's A1 Pacifics were the first successful Pacifics in Britain, and they quickly became the poster boys of the LNER. Most Pacific designs following them were inspired by or built off the improvements made by the A1s. They were certainly trailblazers. Various experiments and trials put on the A1s led to another major development in the late 20s, the Super Pacific, aka the A3 class. These were effectively a compilation of minor modifications made to the original A1 design, with a new higher pressure boiler. All of the A1s were rebuilt into A3s, except for one, and 27 new A3s were built from scratch following this, bringing the total number to 78. The biggest distinction between the A1s and the A3s is the banjo-shaped dome on the top of their boilers. The only A1 that did not become an A3 was the very first, Great Northern. Great Northern somehow escaped rebuilding, and in 1945 was completely rebuilt into the A1/1 class by the LNER's succeeding chief mechanical engineer, Edward Thompson. A controversial rebuild, to say the least. Despite the undisputed success of the A1 and A3 classes, nearly none have survived into preservation. Well, except for one, and you might have heard of him. 1923 was a big year for railway history in Britain. It was the year that grouping occurred, and it was also the year that Flying Scotsman was built. Flying Scotsman is the only preserved A3 class, and it damn well might be the most famous locomotive in the world. The third of the class built, Flying Scotsman was the first new engine delivered to the newly formed LNER, and made its debut to the world wearing its original GNR designated number 1472. Flying Scotsman was named after the famous non-stop long-distance service the LNER offered from King's Cross to Edinburgh, and thus quickly became the poster child of the new railway. On November 30th, 1934, Flying Scotsman made history as the first steam locomotive to officially top 100 miles per hour, with recorded evidence. All this fame scored Scotsman sympathy with a certain Alan Pegler when British Railways announced they'd be scrapping him in 1962. Pegler, a railway enthusiast and businessman, offered to outright buy Flying Scotsman from BR, and they agreed. Scotsman was preserved, and Pegler even struck a deal with BR to run Scotsman on the main line hauling rail tours, remaining exempt from a ban on privately owned steam engines running on the main line. With steam on its way out and water towers being demolished across the system, Scotsman was fitted with a second tender during this time to carry more water and ensure non-stop journeys. Flying Scotsman has had a colorful preservation life. In 1969, he went on tour in the United States and nearly got lost there, was then saved by millionaire businessman William McAlpine, went on tour in Australia in 1988, where it set the record for the longest non-stop run for a steam locomotive at 422 miles, was then later obtained by the National Railway Museum in 2004, where he'd then undergo a 10-year overhaul, and finally returning to steam in 2016, now again hauling rail tours across Britain to this day. Flying Scotsman is in fact Gordon's younger brother, and this is acknowledged in Book 23, Enterprising Engines, when Sir Charles Hatt brought Scotsman to Sodor to reunite the two. The book takes place in 1967, and Scotsman is accurately depicted here as he would have been that year in real life, painted in LNER apple green with his two tenders.
Is that why you have two tenders, being special? No, you'd hardly believe it, Gordon, but over there, There's hardly any coal and water.
1923 presented us with a big green tender engine, but also with a tiny one. For Rex, the miniature engine, was also built this year. The miniature Arlesdale engines are all based on the miniature engines of the real-life Ravenglass and Eskdale Railway. Like Bert with River Ert, Rex is based on the railway's River Esk. River Esk was built in 1923 by Davy Paxman of Colchester to the outline of a standard gauge tender loco. During a rebuild in 1928, River Esk gained a Pulteney steam tender, what is essentially a tender with its own valve gear and propulsion, making the little engine a massive 282-080. This was done in attempts to make the engine stronger, though it proved unsuccessful and was soon removed. The chassis of the steam tender did not go to waste though, and we will come back to that later in the video. Some recent history involving River Esk was a fire that occurred on the railway in 2013. An arson attack set the Ravenglass's workshops ablaze. Within it was River Esk undergoing overhaul. The shop and majority of her parts were destroyed. The new workshop was completed in 2015, and River Esk was eventually fully overhauled, returning to steam in 2018. She is now back at work on the Ravenglass, and can be seen there today. Rex was also built by Davy Paxman in 1923, at the same time as his real-life counterpart. While River Esk went off to the Ravenglass, Rex went off to an unnamed line somewhere in England, where he worked alongside Bert and later Mike. When their line closed in the 60s, the three were brought to Sodor to work the new Arlesdale Railway. Rex is a fairly powerful engine for his size, but rather erratic, and also quite a bit cocky. On to a somewhat elusive character, Jinty, a visiting engine. In Book 12, The 8 Famous Engines, the engines of the Northwestern Railway were due to leave for London for an exhibition, and so a fleet of engines from British Railways were sent over to cover their work. One of the engines was named Jinty, and he was, you guessed it, a Jinty. The Jintys, aka the Fowler 3F class, were a class of 060 tank engines built for the London, Midland, and Scottish Railway. They got the nickname Jinty due to their resemblance to a cartoon character called Ginny Jinty from a popular comic strip at the time. I don't see it. The Jintys were reliable and powerful, and performed so well that the LMS just kept building them. From 1924 to 1931, a whopping 422 of them were built, and could be found all over the region. Many lasted till the end of steam, and a respectable 9 of them are preserved on heritage railways today. The Jinty that appears in the railway series is not depicted with a number, so it's hard to discern which one he was. But thanks to some excellent research by Sodor Island Models, he was able to use context clues to narrow down who it might be. Without going into detail, you should go check out his video on Jinty for that, he was able to conclude that Jinty was likely number 7287, later 47287 under BR. 7287 was built at the North British Locomotive Works in Glasgow, Scotland in 1924. From around 1945 onwards, it worked the Barrow area, and was one of the several engines that listened to Percy's stories at Barrow-in-Furness during his time there. 47287 did not survive into preservation, and was sadly scrapped in 1964. R.I.P. Jinty. In 1928, we got Duncan. Duncan is the 6th engine on the Skarloey Railway, and like all the others, has a real-life counterpart on the Tallyclyn in Wales. Number 6, Douglas. Douglas was built in 1918 at Andrew Barclay and Company's works in Kilmarnock, Scotland. He, at the time numbered 1431, was one of their standard E-class well tanks, and was handed over to the Royal Air Force upon completion. He, along with his sibling locomotive, number 1432, spent his Air Force days at the Calshot Seaplane Station near Southampton, working the short line there. In 1949, the 2 engines were auctioned off to Abelson & Company Limited in Birmingham, and from there was handed over to the Tallyclyn for free in 1953 to clear space. In return for their generosity, the engine was named Douglas after Abelson's chairman. Douglas was rebuilt a bit to suit the Tallyclin's needs, re-gauged to 2 foot 3 inches, and gained a buffer beam. Douglas is still alive and well on the Tallyclin, and since 2018 has been painted in Royal Air Force Blue in honor of its roots. Duncan's story differs quite a bit from Douglas's, though takes some inspiration from it. According to Sodor reading between the lines, Duncan was built 10 years later in 1928. Like Douglas, he was one of Andrew Barclay's standard E-class tanks, and was built at their works in Kilmarnock. Duncan spent the first 30 years of his life working in a factory, and according to Peter Sam, this is where he gets his strong language and temper from. In 1958, he was brought to Sodor to work on the Skarloey Railway, while Skarloey was away being mended. His short wheelbase didn't agree with the Skarloey's rails, and he tended to rock and roll as he went. Duncan enjoyed it at first, until he eventually came off the tracks and embarrassed himself. Coming in at the tail end of the 20s is Duck, from the Great Western Railway. Duck, or formerly Montague, is one of the Great Western's standard 5700 pannier tanks. With over 860 of these built, these panniers were one of the most numerous classes of steam engine in Britain. The pannier tank designs made them ideal engines for almost any job. Water tanks on each side of the boiler gave them a low center of gravity, making them very stable at speed, and the raised tanks above the running board made access much easier for maintenance. The 5700s were built by various builders across the country, and many lasted beyond the end of BR steam, being sold off to industrial railways and other uses. A respectable 16 are preserved, and can be found on various heritage railways across the country. One of which you might recognize from the acclaimed 1970 movie, The Railway Children. Number 5775 was painted in the brown livery of the fictional Great North and South Railway for its appearances in the film. As Duck has recalled many times, he was a pilot engine at Paddington Station in London for most of his life before coming to Sodor. British Railways eventually put him aside, and in 1955 sold him off to the North Western Railway. When Duck arrived on Sodor, he was put to work as the new pilot at Tidmouth. He performed very well, and some years later was put in charge of the branch line to Arlesborough. Duck wears the number plate 5741, and arrived on Sodor with it. The real 5741 was built in one of the first batches of the class in 1929, at the North British Locomotive Works in Glasgow. 5741 went on to work in Wales for most of its life, and was scrapped in 1958, 3 years after Duck would have arrived on Sodor, and contradicting his backstory. As both Wilbert and Chris note, it's more than likely this wasn't the number Duck was given when he was first outshopped in 1929, and at some point got swapped with the real 5741. While we'll probably never know Duck's real number, he was indeed one of the first batch of panniers built in Glasgow in 1929. Duck's nickname, Duck, is an in-joke with Audrey's own model of the character. Audrey's 5700 model arrived to him with uneven wheels, which caused it to waddle as it went along. His children thought it was funny, and christened the model as Duck. And so, this was worked into the character's story.
"What's your name?" asked the Fat Controller. "Montague, sir, but I'm usually called Duck. They say I waddle. I don't really, sir, but I like Duck better than Montague."
Moving into the 30s now, and we have the Big City Engine. The Big City Engine doesn't have an official name. He's known as such simply for that's what his wooden railway toy was called. In the railway series, the engine was one of many from the mainland that brought a train to Sodor and stayed the night, going home the next day. He argued with Gordon over what the big station in London is called. As an LMS engine, the station he would have served was Euston.
"King's Cross," snorted the engine. "London's Euston. Everybody knows that."
The engine is one of the London, Midland and Scottish Railways Patriot class, a class of 52 460 express passenger locomotives, first introduced in 1930. They were nicknamed the Baby Scots for their design was based on that of the previous Royal Scot class. The first two of the class were rebuilds of the previous Cloughton class from the London and North Western Railway, retaining a few minor parts, while the next 40 were new build locos, classified as rebuilds to fudge the accounting books. All took on the numbers of the engines they replaced. These quote-unquote rebuilds occurred at Crewe. An additional 10 all-new Patriots were built following this at Derby. Big City Engine's number was never revealed to us, so we don't know which of the batches he is exactly. Starting in 1946, 18 of the Patriots were rebuilt again with new Stanier 2-type boilers, tenders, and cabs. The final rebuild occurred in 1949, and Big City Engine appeared on Sodor in 1956 in his original form, indicating that he was not one of the 18 rebuilt ones. None of the Patriot class survived, which means Big City Engine likely did not either. However, a new build of an original condition Patriot is currently underway at Tyseley Locomotive Works. The engine will wear the number of the final Patriot built, number 5551, and will be officially named the Unknown Warrior. Currently, it is expected to be finished by 2027. In 1932, another Sodor visitor was built, Pug. Along with Jinty, Pug came to Sodor in 1956 to help fill in for the Northwestern engines while they were away for an exhibition in London. Beyond that, not much is known about him, other than he apparently knows Percy.
"Hello, Jinty!" whistled Percy. "Hello, Pug! They're friends of mine."
Pug is one of the LMS's Kitson 040 saddle tanks. 10 of these little guys were built for light shunting in yards across the LMS's network. The first 5 of the class were all built by Kitson & Company in Leeds in 1932, and the remaining 5 were built years later in 1953 at Horwich Works. These later 5 differed from the first batch notably, with shorter saddle tanks and larger bunkers. Withdrawals started occurring in 1963, and none of this small class survives today. Pug is specifically one of the earlier batch with the longer saddle tank and shorter bunker, as depicted in his illustration. His name, Pug, comes from the common term railwaymen use to call small shunters like him. We're starting to get into slightly more modern engines. Next up is the youngest of the main 11, and that is Oliver. Oliver is one of the Great Western Railway's 1400 class, a 042 tank engine built for fast-running passenger work on branch lines. The 1400 class started out as the 4800 class in 1932 and were a modernized design of the railway's previous 517 class. These engines were built to work with auto coaches and had special equipment that allowed them to push-pull their trains with ease. All were built in Swindon, the final being churned out in 1936. In 1946, the Great Western redesignated the 4800 class label to a series of 280 freight locomotives experimentally converted to oil firing, and the 75 auto tanks were reclassified as the 1400 class. Their numbers were all changed to reflect this. Withdrawals started occurring in 1956, and 4 members of the class do survive in preservation. Aside from Oliver, you may recognize the engine in the form of number 1401 from its starring role in the 1953 comedy film The Titfield Thunderbolt. Despite its notoriety, 1401 was not preserved and was scrapped in 1959. Oliver bore the number 1436 when he made his escape to Sodor in 1967, and he still wears it to this day. The real 1436 was built in 1934 and scrapped in 1958. As Audrey notes, it's pretty doubtful that this was the number allotted to Oliver during the 1946 renumbering. It's up to interpretation how this happened. My favorite theory is that Oliver's crew swapped his number with a scrapped 1400 to throw British Railways off their scent when they made their big escape to Sodor. Oliver the character, however, is based on 1420, a preserved 1400 at the South Devon Railway. Some of the high-quality digital scans of the book illustrations even reveal the number 1420 on Oliver's buffer beam, meaning this engine was likely used as reference for the illustrators. 1420 was also given a name in preservation. a name very similar to Oliver's, Bulliver. Built in 1936 was Green Arrow. Green Arrow is another real engine, and one that Thomas met when he went to the National Railway Museum in 1990. Green Arrow is one of the LNER's V2 class locomotives, a 262 Prairie type, and the first of the class built. The V2s were designed by Sir Nigel Gresley himself to do mixed traffic work across the LNER system. Their outlines and overall designs were very similar to the A3s. They kind of look like mini Flying Scotsmans. Green Arrow was selected for preservation by the National Railway Museum specifically for the innovative design of its monoblock. Most 3-cylinder steam engines have their 3 cylinders separate, but the V2s used a solid monoblock casting with all 3 cylinders and their steam passages built into the same unit. Gresley only used the monoblock on the V2s and the larger P2 class locomotives. The P2s and most of the V2s were rebuilt over time to use normal cylinder castings to simplify maintenance. But Green Arrow retained his till withdrawal and ensured him a spot in preservation. Green Arrow resides today at Danem Gallery Library and Museum in Doncaster. In 2019, it was listed on the National Railway Museum's policy guidance as an engine that could be possibly overhauled. So who knows? We may see Green Arrow steam again sooner than we think. Now here's a name that every train guy knows: Mallard. When it comes to British railway history, Mallard is right up there with Flying Scotsman. Mallard is one of Sir Nigel Gresley's famous A4 class locomotives. In the 30s, when speed and efficiency were all the rage, the LNER and the LMS competed with new streamlined designs that would top each other's speed records. Gresley's answer was the A4, essentially a streamlined version of the A3 class with some new innovations. The first 4 A4s appeared in 1935, painted in special silver livery to haul the streamlined Silver Jubilee service from King's Cross to Newcastle. Following their success, more long-distance services across the network were streamlined, and more A4s were built for them. Mallard was outshopped on March 3, 1938, and later that year would make history. Determined to top the LMS's current speed record, Mallard was hooked up to a dynamometer car and pushed to her full capacity. She topped out at 126 miles per hour, making it the world's fastest steam locomotive, a record that is still yet to be topped. Mallard's big score is somewhat controversial among rail fans, with many arguing that it was unfair as the train was going downhill when the speed was recorded. Nonetheless, the record won Mallard a spot in preservation, and it can be viewed today as the big centerpiece of the National Railway Museum in York. Mallard appears in Book 35, Thomas and the Great Railway Show, snootily claiming that he should be chosen to take a special train over the others at the museum. He's also once mentioned by Gordon in passing.
"Speed's nothing to me," he said. "Why, one of my Doncaster cousins went at 126 miles an hour.
Mallard does not appear in the TV series, but his brother Spencer does. Spencer is also an A4, though the show has never confirmed which one he is exactly. Spencer is kind of a fictional catch-all for the entire A4 class, being painted in a silver livery much like the original Silver Jubilee batch, and claims to be the fastest engine in the world, as per Mallard.
In fact, Spencer still holds the world land speed record for steam locomotives.
1938 was quite the year for streamlined Pacifics, for Duchess of Hamilton was also built this year. The LMS's Coronation class was William Stanier's answer to the speed rivalry between companies. The Coronations were an improved version of his previous Princess Royal class, proving to be one of the most powerful locomotives in all of Britain. The locomotives were designed to be streamlined, however, and the first of the class, Coronation, was outshopped in 1937 with a sleek bullet-like casing. Coronation held the speed record that year at 114 miles per hour, only to be outshined by Mallard the year after. Duchess of Hamilton was part of the second batch, and was also outshopped with the streamlined casing. In 1939, she was disguised as Coronation to appear in the United States at the 1939 World Fair in New York. Following the war in 1945, the LMS opted to remove the streamlined casing on the locomotives to make maintenance easier. Additional Coronations were built following this, all built new without the casing. When withdrawals occurred in the 60s, Hamilton was bought direct from BR along with several other LMS locos to be displayed in a holiday camp, but she eventually found her way into National Railway Museum ownership. In 2005, the museum opted to re-streamline her back into her original form, to have an example of a Coronation class as built. She can be seen there today in this form. When Thomas visited the museum in 1990, he met Hamilton while there. She is accurately depicted in her then non-streamlined form, as she would have been in the 90s. This does beg the question, though. Where did her face go once the streamlining was reapplied? Is it just hidden under the front nose? Does it magically reappear on top of the casing, like Spencer's somehow does? These are the questions that we need answered. Duchess of Hamilton never appears in the TV series, but another Coronation does. The fictional Duchess of Loughborough appears in the series finale Thomas and the Royal Engine. She appears to be a hybrid of Stanier designs, with a name and overall body shape like the unstreamlined Coronations, and smoke deflectors in the style of Royal Scots, not to mention her bizarre LNER-styled tender. Duchess is quite the hodgepodge. Let's jump ahead into the 40s now, and in the post-World War II era. 1948 presented us with the little demons, Bill and Ben. Bill and Ben are a pair of mischievous twin-saddle tank engines that work the China Clay Works near Brendam. The two are unusual in proportions, with an abnormally short height, not much taller than a standard wagon in fact. That is because Bill and Ben are based on another pair of unique twin engines called Alfred and Judy. These two were built by W.G. Bagnall in Stafford for use at Parr Docks in Cornwall. The line to the docks from the nearby China Clay Works needed to travel under the Cornish Main Line, creating a bridge with a mere clearance of 8 feet. In 1916, a Manning-Wardle tank engine was purchased for the line, which was called Punch. When Punch gave out in 1937, an order was made to Bagnall for an abnormally squat tank engine that could traverse the low bridge. The engine that arrived was an 040 saddle tank, which they called Judy, continuing the Punch and Judy theme they had going on. Judy worked alone for some time, and at last a second locomotive was delivered in 1953. This one was named Alfred, after the harbour master, Alfred Truscott. While the engines are nearly identical, there are a couple slight differences. Judy's tanks have rivets, and Alfred's handrails are a bit lower. Together, Alfred and Judy remained at the port of Parr till around 1977 or so, when rail traffic at the port dwindled. Both are preserved and can be found today at the Bodmin and Wedford Railway. Bill and Ben differ from Alfred and Judy in a couple ways. The two are exactly identical and were built at the same time. They were built by Bagnall in 1948 and went on to the China Clay Works on Sodor the same year. They are both younger than Judy by about 11 years, and older than Alfred by about 5. Now I'm kind of breaking my own rules including Barry on this list, as he is a character that does not officially exist. But we know enough about him that I think he deserves a section devoted to him. Barry would have been an IVAT 2MT tank engine. Upon withdrawal from British Railways, he would have been sent to Barry Island Scrapyard in South Wales. Here he would have been found and rescued by the North Western Railway and sent to Sodor. His name, Barry, being an obvious reference to the scrapyard he was saved from. Barry was set to appear in his own book written by Chris Awdry. The book never happened though, because as Chris claims, audiences and the publishers simply wanted more Thomas and his friends, and not more new engines. He quotes, "I haven't altogether given up. You could say Barry is dead, but not yet buried." The IVAT 2MTs were an LMS design, designed by Henry George IVAT, first introduced in 1946 before all the railways were nationalized into British Railways, and they continued to be built well into the BR era. The design was based on Stanley's previous 262 tanks of 1935, which in turn were based on the previous examples designed by Henry Fowler in 1927. Tender variants of the engines were also produced, known simply as the IVAT Class II 260s. All of the 2MTs were withdrawn by 1967. 4 were sent to Berry Island Scrapyard in real life, numbers 41312, 41313, 41303, and 41248. All were built at Crew Works between 1949 and 1952, and the former 2 are preserved. Berry is likely one of the 2 that didn't make it, either 41303 or 41248. Although, of course, it's also possible that he could have just been an entirely fictional add-on member. We simply just don't know the details. While Berry never did officially exist, the 2MT did live on in the TV series in the form of Arthur. Arthur is specifically based on another preserved 2MT, number 41241, built in 1949. This engine lives today on the Keighley and Worth Valley Railway. And our final standard gauge steam engine on this list, good old Wilbert. Wilbert is, again, another real engine. He is one of Hunslet's many, many austerity 060 saddle tank engines. These saddle tanks first saw production in 1948, after Hunslet had persuaded the British War Department a tank engine similar to their previous 50550 class would perform well for them. In total, 485 austerity tanks were built at various works across Britain, with many still being built well into the 60s. As well as the War Department, many saw use on industrial lines and collieries, with the last still in service all the way into the 1980s. A whopping 70 or so of these are preserved, and are a very common sight on heritage lines. Wilbert, specifically, was built in 1953 at Hunslet's Works in Leeds. The engine worked in collieries for its entire service life, ending at the West Cannock No. 5 Colliery in Staffordshire. From there, in 1972, he was purchased for the Dean Forest Railway, and has lived there since. He was originally named G.B. Keeling after the chief mechanical engineer of the Severn and Wye Railway, north of the Dean Forest. However, in 1987, the engine was officially renamed after the then chairman of the Dean Forest Railway, Reverend Wilbert Awdry himself. Awdry was present for the naming ceremony. Nowadays, Reverend Wilbert Awdry, or simply just Wilbert for short, is still at the Dean Forest, although is in pieces at the moment and awaiting overhaul. In the Railway Series in 1993, Sir Stephen Hatt considered trialling an austerity engine on the Little Western, and brought over Wilbert to help out for a while. Wilbert performed splendidly, and this reaffirmed Hatt's decision to purchase an austerity for his railway. This engine, however, is never brought up again. To this day, Wilbert is the youngest standard gauge steam locomotive character of the Railway Series. There is another engine in the series that is the same type as Wilbert that he once spoke of, 16, an austerity that worked on the mainland. However, we don't have any specifics on 16's origins or where he is now. As Wilbert says, he is one of the 70 preserved examples and lives somewhere in the Midlands now, but it's left rather vague. Finally, our first Diesel character, and appropriately, it's Diesel himself. Devious Diesel is one of British Railway's numerous Class 08 shunters. The Class 08s are Britain's ultimate general-purpose shunting locomotive. They're heavy, they're strong, they're powerful, and they have excellent tractive effort. The proof is in the pudding. There were 996 of them built, making them the most numerous of any British engine class ever. These locomotives were first outshopped all the way back in 1952, and a sizable 100 of them are still used on major rail networks to this day. You know what they say, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Once again, as determined by Soder Island Models' excellent research, check out his video on Diesel if you haven't already, it's very much plausible that Diesel was number 13236. Should this be true, it means Diesel would have been outshopped from Darlington Works in 1956, the year before he went to Sodor on his trial. Diesel stirred up trouble on Sodor and was sent back in disgrace. Once returned to the mainland, 13236 remained in British Railways service for another 31 years and was withdrawn in 1988. 13236 is indeed preserved and spent some years on the Battlefield Railway. Following that, it spent a spell from 2008 to 2014 on the Bluebell Railway. Yup, Diesel met Stepney. Wild. As of today, 13236 is the shunter for Nemesis Rail at their depot in Burton-on-Trent. Class 08s are a common sight in the TV series. We got Paxton, Sydney, Arry, Bert, Splatter, Dodge, and even some generic mainland ones, which wear a livery very similar to real-life EWS examples. Neat. The abundance of 08 characters in the show mirrors just how common a sight the 08s are in real life. They are all over the railways of Britain. 1 year later saw the construction of a rather friendly diesel, Rusty. Rusty was the first diesel on the Skarloey Railway, and is officially its 5th engine. Like all the Skarloey engines, he has a real-life Talyclin counterpart, Midlander. This diesel was one of Ruston and Hornsby's standard 44/48 HP narrow-gauge diesels, and started its life in 1940 at a granite quarry. In 1956, the diesel was sold to the Talyclin Railway, who were in dire need of a diesel for slow-speed maintenance work. After arrival, Midlander was re-gauged, given buffers, and put to work. It proved invaluable to the railway, and by the 70s, Midlander was getting worn out, and the parts needed to mend it were becoming increasingly hard to find. In 1980, Midlander re-emerged from Pendray Works with an entirely new engine, and a new body shell and cab to match, giving it a very different appearance to what it used to look like. It still looks the same today, 40 years later, and is still proving to be an invaluable asset to the Talyclin. Just like Midlander, Rusty is one of Ruston and Hornsby's standard 44/48 HP narrow-gauge diesels. However, was built much later in 1957 to the order of Sir Handel Brown. Rusty arrived on the railway that year to help out while Skarloey and Rheneas were both away. He, along with the railway's chief mechanical engineer, Mr. Hugh, worked hard to clean up the line and return it to its former glory. To this day, Rusty is used frequently by the work crews to maintain the line. His name, Rusty, is a clever combination of his builders' names, Ruston and Hornsby. Unlike Midlander, Rusty was never rebuilt, and still maintains his original outline. 1958 saw the year our first big diesel engine of the series was built, Boco. Boco is a British Railways Class 28, a Cobo design, hence his name. 20 of these diesels were built by Metropolitan Vickers, first emerging from their Bowesfield works in Stockton-on-Tee in 1958. The 28s were often used in pairs for the Condor service, an overnight express container freight train from London to Glasgow. These diesels were notorious for frequent engine failures though, and prone to coughing up unacceptable amounts of smoke. The entire class went back to the manufacturer in 1961 to be refitted, though it was ultimately a lost cause. Following their return, the 28s serviced the Barrow-in-Furness area, until BR ultimately pulled the plug on them in 1967 for being non-standard designs. They lasted a measly 10 years in service. Contrary to many others, Boco is actually real. He came to Sodor wearing the number D5702, which was the third of the class built on September 29, 1958. Boco worked the Barrow-in-Furness area with his brothers following the 1961 refit, and one day in '65 made his way to Brendam with a goods train. Sir Charles Hatt expressed interest in him, and British Railways, already fed up with the 28s, allowed him to keep Boco for trials. Boco proved satisfactory, and became the railway's second official diesel, after Daisy. Unlike Diesel and Daisy though, Boco had no qualms with the steam engines, and was easy to get along with. In real life, D5702 was scrapped in 1969, but I think I like its fate in the Railway Series universe quite a bit more. Interestingly, Boco had a brother that had very different opinions on steam engines. In Enterprising Engines, Oliver tells Douglas of his escape to Sodor, and how BR diesels would often prowl the rails at night searching for him. One of these evil diesels depicted in the illustration is a Class 28, painted in BR's rail blue livery. In real life, only a single Class 28 was ever painted in this modern livery, and that was D5701. A single Class 28 survives in preservation in real life, number D5705, and it currently resides on the East Lancashire Railway, awaiting restoration. The 60s was the era of the diesels. Introduced in 1960 was the glamorous diesel railcar herself, Daisy. Daisy is a British Railways Class 101 railcar. The Class 101s were multiple diesel units designed and built by Metro Cammell in Birmingham in 2, 3, and 4-car sets, for use on suburban and lighter branch line services. The first batch emerged in 1956 and continued to be built until 1960. These were some of the most successful and longest-lasting diesel multiple units in Britain, with the final being withdrawn from service fairly recently in 2003. 41 cars are preserved today and are a common sight on heritage railways. One of the final 101s in service, number 101685, withdrawn in December 2003, was preserved on the North Yorkshire Moors Railway and was named Daisy after the character. Daisy was built specifically to the order of Sir Charles Hat for use on the Farquhar branch line. Unlike the real 101s, Daisy is unique, for she only consists of a single car. She was built by Metro Cammell in their works in Birmingham in 1960 and sent straight to Sodor upon completion. As a brand spanking new diesel, Daisy thought very highly of herself and looked down on the steam engines. She has since learned sense and was humbled over time, though she still has her snooty moments. A lot of diesels built this year. Next up is Class 40. Class 40 goes by many names. In the Railway series, he is D4711. In the TV series, he is D261. And to the engines, he's just the diesel. Regardless, Class 40 is exactly what his name suggests he is. A British Railways Class 40. The Class 40s were massive express diesels, first built in 1958. 200 were built, and were nicknamed Whistlers for the distinctive whistling sound their turbochargers made. The Class 40s were found to be underpowered due to their sheer weight affecting their performance. Nonetheless, they had a service life of about 30 years, with final withdrawals occurring in 1988. 7 are preserved today on various heritage railways. Class 40 came to Sodor on trial in 1962. He was very cocky and rude to the steam engines, only to eat his words the next day when he accidentally sucked up an inspector's hat in his air intake and broke down in front of everyone. Sir Charles Hat was not impressed with the diesel and sent him back in disgrace. Class 40's number in the illustrations is D4711, which is very strange, for not only did no Class 40 wear this number in real life, but it's completely unlike the numbering system, utilizing 4 digits instead of 3. D4711 is, as you guessed it, entirely fictional, and I genuinely wonder what the number means. Perhaps it's just a random number the illustrators decided to give him, or maybe it's like a specific date or something. It's anyone's guess. In a wacky turn of events, though, the TV series had the more realistic take. Class 40's number in the show was D261, which was, in fact, worn by an actual Class 40. The real D261 was outshopped from Vulcan Foundry on February 26, 1960. It had a working life of about 23 years, before it was withdrawn in 1983 and scrapped at Crewe the following year. The Class 40 talk does not end there, for we have yet another one to discuss. 40125, or as the engines knew him, Old Stuck-Up. Old Stuck-Up was a Class 40 that visited Sodor and was snooty to the engines. He got what he deserved in the end though, when he slipped on oily rails and crashed through the rear of the engine shed. The diesel was sent home in disgrace, never to return. The events of the story Old Stuck Up occur in 1984, which doesn't exactly correlate with real life. 40125 was, in fact, a real Class 40. It was built December 1960, originally numbered D352, and later renumbered 40125 under the TOPS system in 1974. 40125 was withdrawn in 1981 and scrapped at Swindon by 83, a whole year before he would have visited Sodor. Bit of a contradiction there. Either way, this haughty diesel meant a pretty unfortunate fate. I'll be honest, I'm not entirely sure 1961 is the correct build year for Mavis, and I will explain why shortly. Mavis is one of British Railway's Class 04 diesel shunters, specifically a variant with cow catchers and side plates. These diesels were designed by Drury Car Company and built at the Vulcan Foundry in Newton-le-Willows, west of Manchester. The very first 4 of the first batch were outshopped in 1952, all fitted with cow catchers and side plates for use on the Wisbech and Upwell Tramway, where they took over for the aging J70 tram locomotives. Over 140 were built in total up to 1962, and found use in yards and short lines across the country. A whopping 20 are preserved, including one of that first batch that worked on the Wisbech. Now Mavis is a bit of a weird one. She is specifically based on the 04s built in that first batch, with the square cab windows. However, she has the conical-shaped exhaust that was implemented on the second batch of the 04s onwards, so she's a bit of a hybrid of the two. As Audrey noted in the 1979 annual, Mavis arrived on Sodor a year later than Daisy. Daisy arrived in 1960, so that would make Mavis's arrival 1961. Though I think he's referring to the year he constructed his own model of Mavis here, more so than Mavis the character. The Island of Sodor book and Sodor Reading Between the Lines are intentionally vague on her arrival date, so it's pretty much up to interpretation. Her varying the old cab with square windows suggests that she was built around the time of the original batch in 1952, and perhaps rebuilt at a later date before going to Sodor, gaining her cone exhaust. Personally, I like the idea she was built to order in 61. Her being younger would better suit her cockiness and lack of experience in her first stories. What are all your thoughts? Next up are the later 3 mountain engines: Patrick, Alaric, and Eric. These 3 engines are based on numbers 6, 7, and 8 on the Snowdon Mountain Railway: Padarn, Ralph, and Erery. Like the original 5, these engines were designed and built at the Swiss Locomotive and Machine Works in Winterthur, Switzerland, in the early 1920s. Padarn, the first, was built in 1922, and the other 2 the year after. Unlike the original 5, these 3 had less boxy proportions. They were of a more superheated design, and proved to be much more powerful. Padarn was originally named Sir Harmud after the railway's chairman, and later renamed Padarn in 1928 after the 6th century saint. And sadly, he is the only of the 3 that remains in service today. Ralph and Erery were both withdrawn in the early 90s, and have since been dismantled. With the rise in diesel power on the line, it's very unlikely the 2 will ever be rebuilt. Padarn remains as the lone survivor of his design on the railway, and is still in regular use. Now Patrick, Alaric, and Eric mirror their real-life counterparts, though they differ greatly in age by about 40 years. By 1960, at 60 years old, the original 5 mountain engines, sans Godred of course, were aging, and newer engines were needed to take on the ever-increasing traffic on the Culdee Fell. An order was put in for 3 more engines from Switzerland. The first, Lord Harry, arrived in March 1962, Alaric in May, and Eric in August. While the new engines proved to be powerful, Lord Harry was one not that easy to get along with. He was named after the railway's chairman, Lord Harry Baraine. Cocky and reckless, he once derailed himself at the summit, which led to a brief suspension from passenger work. But after a courageous act saving some climbers in a storm, the railway reinstated him, and renamed him Patrick after one of the climbers he saved. Unlike their real-life counterparts, all 3 of the new engines are still around and at work today on the Culdee Fell. "1962 also gave us fan-favorite character, the Works Diesel. You know, the Works Diesel." What, you're telling me this isn't your favorite character? While there isn't much known about this guy, even his name for that matter, the Works Diesel is based at Croven's Gate, and is sent out on rescue missions when engines break down on the line. He pops up throughout Chris Awdry's tenure, first appearing in Book 28, James and the Diesel Engines. The Works Diesel is a British Railways Class 47. The Class 47s were first introduced in 1962, built at Brush Traction, formerly Falcon Works, in Loughborough, and at Crewe. A whopping 512 of these were built, making them the most numerous class of British mainline diesel. They are certainly a reliable class, and are still a common sight on the railways today. 51 still remain in service on the main line, and 32 are preserved. You just cannot kill these guys. The 47s were all built between 1962 and 1968. Unfortunately, the number on the Works Diesel's sides is illegible. Kinda looks like 47211, or maybe 47111, tough to say. As we don't know which one he is, we can't place an exact build year for him. "1963 gave us another big diesel, D199, or as the engines know him, Spam Can. Old Spam Can came to Sodor on trial in 1967 with a fellow Class 35. Like most big diesels during this period, he was snooty and insulted the steam engines. He got his comeuppance later on, when he failed hauling a train of oil tankers and had to be rescued by Henry. D199 is a British Railways Class 46 Peak. The 46s, along with the very similar 45s and 44s, are often referred to as peaks, as the Class 44s were all named after mountains. 56 of the 46s were built at Derby Works from 1961 to 1963. They were all withdrawn by 1984, and 3 are preserved. One 46 of interest in real life is D146, later renumbered 46009. On July 17, 1984, it was used as fodder in a nuclear flask crash test. The diesel, hauling 3 Mark I coaches, was deliberately crashed into a nuclear waste flask at 100 miles per hour. It was modified to run remotely, so no one was on board during. The test was done to demonstrate to the public that no radioactive waste would leak out of a flask in the event of an accident while transported on rail. The flask remained intact. However, 47009 was blown to smithereens on impact and was scrapped on site. The highest number the original 46s wore was D193, making Spam Can's D199 entirely fictional. However, as a later member of the class, that would mean he was more than likely built at Derby in 1963. Next up is Bear, a very overlooked diesel. Bear came to Sodor on trial with D199 in 1967. He is a British Railways Class 35, also known as a High-Mech, a nickname the class gained for their hydraulic Mech-Edo transmissions. The Class 35s were all built by Bear, Peacock & Company in Manchester, and spent their working lives in mostly the western region. The class's downfall came from their hydraulic transmissions being non-standard, and BR chose to withdraw them fairly early in the 70s. After only about 10 years in service, the High-Mechs were all withdrawn by 1975. 4 are preserved, thankfully. Bear's BR number was the fictional D7101. The final number of the class was 7100, making Bear the fictional actual last member. As the High-Mechs were all built in numerical order, it means Bear would have been built last in 1964. He came to Sodor on trial, and while 199 did not meet expectations, Sir Charles Hatt saw potential in 7101, and bought him for the railway. His name, Bear, was given to him by the other engines, for the distinctive growl his engine makes.
It's nicer than just a number. he says. Having a name means that you really belong.
Next up is Mike, the third engine of the miniature Arlesdale Railway. Mike is particularly young, being built much later than the others in 1966. He, like Bert and Rex before him, has a real-life counterpart on the Ravenglass and Eskdale Railway in the Lake District, River Mite. Now remember earlier when we discussed that Pulteney steam tender that River Esk was fitted with? Well, they returned River Esk to normal after the tender proved unsuccessful. The Pulteney chassis sat in storage for nearly 40 years when the railway decided to put it to use finally, using its frames for the tender of a new steam locomotive. The locomotive, named River Mite, was built by H. Clarkson & Son, a model engine building company in York, and was delivered to the Ravenglass in 1966. Like River Esk, it had the outline of a standard gauge locomotive. It has been on the Ravenglass ever since, and can still be seen there today. As much as I would love to tell you that Mike was also made out of Rex's old butt, that's not the case with him. Mike was built from the ground up by H. Clarkson & Son also in 1966, based on the design that they used for River Mite, with some improvements. He was delivered to an unnamed railway somewhere in England, where he worked alongside Rex and Bert for a grand total of 1 year before its closure. During his short time on this railway, he was painted green, and the passengers often got him and Rex confused. The three relocated to the Arlesdale Railway on Sodor in 1967, and here Mike was repainted red to stand out. Mike is a bit of a grumpy sort, and he doesn't get on very well with the passengers. He actually prefers hauling trucks to coaches. And we now have our first engine of the video built on the island of Sodor. Frank, of the miniature Arlesdale Railway. Like the others, Frank is based on a real engine of the Ravenglass and Eskdale Railway, Perkins. Perkins is an interesting diesel. It started life simply as a Muir Hill rail tractor and arrived in 1929. It was rebuilt at the Ravenglass's workshops, gaining an extra bogie set and into the outline of a steam locomotive. As a faux steam engine, it was nicknamed Pretender. In 1984, the Ravenglass rebuilt the diesel again, this time ridding the steam engine outline and into the form of a more conventional diesel. Following this final rebuild, the engine was renamed Perkins, after the new Perkins engine it was fitted with. Perkins is still around today, and used mostly for slow-speed work such as mowing and weeding. Frank is based on Perkins' latest rebuild, but he has a very different history, however. Frank was built on Sodor in the Arlesdale's workshops at Arlesborough West, and was outshopped in 1967, shortly after the railway opened, and preceding Perkins' rebuild by about 17 years. Frank was still being built during the events of Book 22, Small Railway Engines, as he was never seen by Wilbert Awdry when he and Teddy Boston visited the line. He does not appear in it. When Frank later found out about this, he felt insulted and rebelled by refusing to work, which only resulted him colliding into the back of the shed. We have come to the youngest standard gauge engines on the island of Sodor. Built as early as 1975 are Pip and Emma. Philippa, or Pip for short, and Emma are a British Railways Class 43 high-speed train set with an engine at each end. One of the most recognizable trains in British railway history, the HSTs are the fastest diesel-powered locomotives in the world, with an absolute top speed of 148 miles per hour. The HST came about in the early 70s, when British Railways were looking for a way to modernize their network. Tight finances meant they could not electrify the entirety of the main lines, and so a sort of high-speed diesel engine would have to be developed. It took many steps and hiccups in development before finally arriving at what would be the Class 43. 2 prototypes were constructed in 1972, one of which is preserved. These proved successful, and a production order went into effect with some aesthetic changes. In 1975, the first official HSTs emerged from Crewe Works and began their nearly 50-year reign on Britain's rails. The HSTs were very successful, as evident by the fact that they are still in use today. In recent years, the HSTs have started to be phased out in certain parts of the country, and preservation efforts are blossoming. The first production HST, number 43002, had its final run in 2019 and is now preserved at the National Railway Museum in York. Pip and Emma used to be part of British Railways fleet and made the occasional trip onto Sodor's metals on more than one occasion. In 1986, they temporarily took over for Gordon while he was away in Carlisle, and in 1995, they escorted Prince Charles to Sodor in honor of the Railway Series Golden Jubilee. As stated in Sodor Reading Between the Lines, Sir Stephen Hatt had intentions to purchase Pip and Emma for his railway as far back as 2005. This purchase eventually went through in 2011, and Pip and Emma now man a direct high-speed service from Tidmouth to London, which unfortunately forced Gordon into retirement. Pip and Emma's numbers are not visible in any of their illustrations, nor are they ever revealed in lore material, so we don't know which ones they are meant to be or what year that they were built. They could have been built any time between 1975 and 1982. And rounding out the 70s is Jock, the newest locomotive on the Arlesdale Railway. Jock is based on Northern Rock, a steam engine built within the workshops of the Ravenglass and Eskdale Railway. In the early 70s, the decision was made to build a new engine to supplement the existing fleet. They wanted an engine with a taller narrow gauge outline that would match the higher profiles of the line's new enclosed saloon coaches. The end result was a 262 tender locomotive, with a large cab and a tall chimney to match. They originally planned to name it Sir Arthur Heywood, the inventor of 15-inch minimum gauge, but ultimately decided to name it after their biggest funder, Northern Rock Bank. Northern Rock was a successful locomotive and has gained some notoriety worldwide, especially in Japan. The Ravenglass even built an identical locomotive named Northern Rock 2 for use in Japan. This replica can be seen today at the Shuzenji Romney Railway. Jock, however, was built on Sodor at the Arlesdale workshops. He was designed by the railway's chief engineer, Ivan Ferrier, who worked in consultation with the Ravenglass's chief engineer at the same time Northern Rock was built, hence the similarities between the two. He was outshopped in 1976, still in a yellow undercoat. The color reminded Douglas of the engines on the Highland Railway back in Scotland, which were nicknamed Jocks. The name stuck, and so did the yellow livery. Jock is easily the little railway's strongest locomotive, and the largest. Right at the tail end of the 1980s is Fred, the other diesel on the Skarloey Railway. Now again, I'm kind of breaking my own rules here by including Fred in this video. After all, he was never ever seen in any illustrations, and is merely only mentioned by Rusty once, but it felt wrong not to include him. Fred is based on the Talyllyn Railway's Alf, a boxy open cab diesel shunter. Alf is an amalgamation of two diesels. The Talyllyn acquired two disused Hunslet diesels in 1970. At the time, both of the Talyllyn's diesels, Midlander and Merseyside, were out of action, and the railway was in dire need of a diesel to assist in general maintenance work. The best parts of both Hunslets were taken off and combined together into one diesel. While it's not the fastest diesel around, nor the most attractive, Alf is certainly powerful, and has proved invaluable to the Talyllyn ever since. Fred's story mirrors Alf's. Fred is much younger, and was built at Crovan's Gate on Sodor in 1989 as a backup for Rusty. Like Alf, he was constructed by combining two diesels into one. Now, since engines are alive in this universe, I don't exactly know how this works. Are those two diesels just dead now? Does Fred have a mix of their personalities, or is he just like a brand new thing? It's probably best not to ask questions. Fred has not done much in the series, and he is considered rather lazy. He apparently plays ill to get out of work, much to Rusty's annoyance. And the youngest locomotive on the island of Sodor and in the railway series is Ivo Hugh. Ivo Hugh only appears in the final story of one of the final books, Book 40, New Little Engine. He is based on the Talyllyn Railway's No. 7 Tom Rolt, a new-build engine. The engine that eventually became Tom Rolt started life as an Andrew Barclay 040 well tank built in 1949, not all that dissimilar from Douglas and Duncan, in fact. The engine, along with two others, went to Ireland and spent its working life on the Bord na Móna Company's railway. The engines were very capable, but their tendency to throw sparks and their heavy weight proved unsuitable for the line. Consequently, they were put into storage only after a few years of service. The engines were all sold off, and ours was purchased for the Talyllyn Railway in 1969. It took 20 years, but over time, the engine was substantially rebuilt to suit the Talyllyn's needs. Regauged to 2'3", new chimney, new side tanks, etc. During its rebuild, the engine was commonly referred to as Irish Pete, and that almost became its official name. When finally complete in 1991, the engine had a naming ceremony and was officially dubbed Tom Rolt, after the man who formed the society that preserved the Talyllyn Railway back in the 50s. Tom Rolt is still in use today and can be seen hauling passengers on its little line in Wales. Ivo Hugh's story differs from Tom Rolt's. For one, Ivo Hugh is much younger, having been completed in 1996. He was built from scratch at Crovan's Gate, and his similarities to Tom Rolt are explained away by the Skarloey's men taking great inspiration from the new engine over in Wales. Ivo Hugh was given a naming ceremony on his first day, in which he was named after the railway's chief mechanical engineer, Mr. Ivo Hugh. And we're done! At just over 2 hours too. I did not go into this thinking this would be the new longest video on the channel, but there's just so much info on these characters and their histories. I even tried to be as brief as possible, and condensed so much. For this Pick of the Week, I want to shout out a series of videos that were incredibly helpful in putting this together. The Talyllyn Railway's Engine Stories series. These are a couple years old now, so more than likely most of you have already seen these, but for those who haven't, go check them out. They provide a thorough timeline of each of the engine's histories, complete with old photos and footage that cannot be found anywhere else. I referred to these for every single one of the Skarloey engine sections of this video, so I wanted to show my gratitude by shouting out the railway. Appropriately, the weekend of posting this video is the weekend of Audrey Extravaganza 4 at the Talyllyn. There's a lot of big things happening there, so stay up to date on the railway's socials for the events that unfold. I am really sad that I couldn't be there this year, and I hope all of you that are there right now have a blast. I hope you all learned something new about the characters today. I certainly did. Some things that I learned from my research for this that I never knew before are Rheneas is older than Dalgach by a year, Mavis is a weird hybrid of the first and second batch of 04s. Duke was not built at the same location as the other small Englands. Wilbert is the youngest standard gauge steam engine of the series. And that there is a DMU named after Daisy in real life. This is why I love making big info dump videos like this. They do take forever to make and are pretty stressful, but I actually learned something new myself from working on them. I want to give a big thank you to my good friend Nemo, aka WR Duke Dog, who proofread the entire script for this video and made sure all the info was accurate. This guy is an encyclopedia of railway knowledge. I don't know anyone who is more well versed in British railway history than him. Thanks for all the help, Nemo. It's greatly appreciated. And that is all I have for you guys. If you made it this far, thank you so much for watching. And as always, a big thank you to my patrons for the continued support. You were all very patient with the making of this video, and I appreciate that. I'll see you all in the next one, folks. Bye-bye!